very much. Actually, the thing I like to be known for is that I run 6 to 8 miles, but that's another story. I'm truly honored to be here tonight. I do a fair number of these kinds of programs all over the United States. But I have to say that the presentation that the Imam gave was the most singular presentation I've heard in my career for its inclusiveness. In a very brief period of time, he talked about, from my point of view, provided a vision of Islam and a vision of a Muslim community and a Muslim community part of the broader community that is truly inclusive. And his description of the membership of this community, your relatively singular situation here is known outside of this area quite a bit. I mean, when I would tell people I was coming here, those that knew, the first thing they would talk about is how inclusive. And they talk about, the fact that there's Sunni and Shia, and then the different ethnic groups, etc., which I think is a remarkable situation, especially those of us who come from Muslim backgrounds, or those of us who have sort of intensively been immersed in Muslim backgrounds all over the world, as I have for about 40 years. I could tell you some real stories about lack of inclusiveness as well as inclusiveness. So I'll try to be brief and make some points that I think are important to keep in mind. In the 21st century, what is distinctive about Muslim identity in the 21st century is that it is distinctively different than Muslim identity in the last half of the 20th century. In the last half of the 20th century, we were always talking, whether we were Muslim or non-Muslim, we were talking about Muslims on the Americanization path, but it was more on the Americanization path, and sort of early in that path, moving forward. And we were looking at the fact that you had a community that was, for a long time, invisible. When I was growing up, even when I studied Islam, I began to study Islam in the late 1960s. And most of you can tell that I dye my hair in order to look older than I am. When I got into the field, Muslims were invisible. I was raised in cosmopolitan New York. No, you weren't aware of mosques or Islamic centers. I lived in New England, etc. And they were, if they were there as individuals, they did not, quote, stand out, and the reality of it is, as we know, both in the US and Europe now, in a matter of decades, Islam is the second or third largest religion. But in establishing those roots, it was really going from the periphery and hoping in the last half of the 20th century to move from the periphery to the center. To move from being seen, quote, simply as something that one didn't know about, curious. When I got into the field, it was just the exotic kind of thing. All Muslims are sort of Arab. Arabs have all those stereotypes of Arabs, camels, tents, or Mercedes-Benz, and oil fields. And then it moved to, Kalashnikovs, etc. And being on that margin meant being on the margin economically, not just visibly, being certainly on the margin politically, not only because that for every community you have to make it into the political and economic system, but also because many Muslims chose to opt out of that system. So for many Muslims, participating in the political system was something that they weren't quite sure they were going to do. And I can remember speaking to communities 30 and 40 years ago and telling them, you're in an awkward situation here. If you've come to America from overseas, you've come here, you want to be accepted, you want to have that job in the hospital, in the university, whatever. You want to be able to live where you want to be able to live, but principally or primarily, you only want to be among your own. And therefore, how can you be known if you're not out there? And how can you actually integrate yourself into the community? It was a little bit like when I was growing up. My grandmother didn't speak English or barely spoke English. She interacted only with people who spoke Italian. And so there was a real difference between the extent to which my grandmother got integrated into the community and the extent to which my father and then we did. And there was that also that, as a result, I always love doing these talks because then I don't follow them. I'm divinely inspired. Uh-oh, we got a problem. Let's not go there. Those of us that know our Islamic history or our Christian history. Okay, but you know, it always struck me as kind of funny when you actually looked at the situation of what was unfolding in America, that it took a long time to get beyond a situation where I would land in a city and I would say, okay, show me the Turkish mosque, show me the Kuwaiti mosque, show me the Pakistani mosque. And I used to say often when I would speak, I'd say, you know, this is a great city. You've got more mosques than you have Muslims. You know, all the little kinds of things. But everybody would always talk about the ummah, you know. Everybody believed in the ummah, but we didn't necessarily intermarry within the ummah. And we didn't necessarily pray in the different mosques. We felt uncomfortable with it. You fast forward to the 21st century, and on the issue of some areas of immigration, which I'll talk about, there are issues. But when you get to the 21st century, Muslims are very much part of the landscape of America. They are now part of that mosaic. Before, in the old days, you could say you're part of the mosaic, but in fact what you were really saying is you're on the periphery of the mosaic, probably invisible in the mosaic, because all the other pieces would stand out more and would kind of be known more. That is changing very, very quickly. The rate at which you've moved into the professions and into visible positions in a variety of professions is actually really quite quick. I mean, growing up as an Italian American, and even as a young professor, I remember going to dinner with my wife. We lived in a suburb in Massachusetts with neighbors who knew me. And they were talking about Italians and mafia all night, and particularly a guy who came into the neighborhood, bought the biggest house, had the biggest car, and how he must be mafia, etc. And when I came out, I said to my wife, these people know me. They know I'm Italian American. She said, you're not Italian, you have a PhD. And that was the case, you know, because in my neighborhood, when you grew up, everybody tried to be like their older brother, and their older brother tried to be like their father, and almost everybody in the neighborhood was basically blue collar. So, and so we were like the exception, a small group of us within the family who went to college. And then from there, one thought about going to university or doing, you know, whatever it was you were going to do. But for most people, the notion, you know, of Italians was that we're people who are good with our hands, and we're very good with cement. You know, we build patios, we're big on construction, building houses. So we use cement to build, and we use cement to put people in, i.e. the mafia. And the movies in those days, we were the people that often now Muslims are, where you don't even have to identify them, but you have somebody who has swarthy skin, you know, kind of dark skin compared to the rest, somebody who's kind of loud and emotive. Unfortunately, I am, but my dad wasn't, fulfilling that stereotype. Somebody who could be criminal, you know, when you had to have that kind of shady person who's a criminal. Somebody who pushed his women around, you know, etc. Although I must say, I remember one of the great stories of my dad, where my mother was coming and hearing my aunt yelling at my uncle, and coming up, and there she was pointing a knife at him, saying, come on, you know. But we don't want to get into that. I don't tell my students those stories. But Muslims have come so much farther in a brief period of time. Let me give you some idea of some indices of where you are as a community. There was a time when I didn't do this, and then I realized when I started telling American Muslims, they're not even aware of their own stats of the community. Muslims come from more than 68 countries, as well as having African American Muslims, as you know, Hispanic Muslims, and Caucasian Muslims. I love that word Caucasian. Every time I fill out a form, I don't know who I am. And I keep looking around, you know, it's like, who am I? Well, I'm really not white. And then I see Caucasian, and that sounds like the Caucasus. So I still haven't quite put together why I'm Caucasian, but anyway. One of the most diverse religious groups, racially, economically, and politically. Education is a priority, not just because we say it. Muslims are second to American Jews in education. Okay, that's number one. 40% of Muslims have college degrees versus 29% of other Americans. 40% versus 29%. Muslim women, unlike their Jewish counterparts, are statistically as likely as Muslim men to hold college degrees or postgraduate degrees. They are obviously brighter and more accomplished, but we don't work that into our data, in terms of the Gallup data. because we don't want the males who are a minority to feel threatened. All right. Muslims span the socioeconomic spectrum. They're professionals, they're doctors, lawyers, engineers, educators, corporate executives, small business owners, blue-collar workers, and laborers. They're the guy that used to drive me to Pakistani in Washington, and one day he said to me, you know, Professor, they always say that we Pakistanis really don't, you know, we kind of treat our women as second-class citizens. He said, my wife's in Pakistan, I go back regularly, drive my cab, go back to take care of it. She wants to come here. I keep telling her, don't come here because you're not going to have a servant, you're not going to have... She comes here. He said, so now I'm stuck in this small apartment. She's given up her house. She's difficult to live with. And he said, I'm very liberal. Every day I say to her, go out to work, get a job, get a job. He said, so I'm fully American. There's no problem, you know. He said, but she won't go out, but she's still at home, you know, upset. All right, so 70% of Muslims report they have a job compared to 64% overall of Americans. 70, it's not, and what's really surprising is Muslims will talk about after 9/11, many of them, feeling profiled, feeling a bit threatened, but on the other hand, Muslims actually believe in the American dream. Now, let me set you straight. The American dream exists, but not for everybody, okay? My wife and I are lucky enough to be blue collar who made the American dream. And I can tell you, the American dream is based not only on hard work, you just have to be lucky. When I got into my field, there were no jobs. Who wanted to hire anybody doing Islam? I have 2 nephews doing PhDs in classics at the top universities. Guess what the market looks like in classics, okay? So, but Muslims are far more optimistic. Why? Because of the kind of stats I'm giving you on education, on economy. Muslims are economically the equivalent or equal to other Americans, and in many areas ahead of other Americans economically. So when Muslims are asked about how they feel, this is about 2 years ago, about their future in the next 5 years, far more optimistic than the average non-Muslim American about their future, okay? Among non-working Muslims, 31% are full-time students, compared to 10% of the general population. 31% compared to 10% of the population. Also a very young group. The sample size of Muslims over 65 is so small that Gallup couldn't study it. So a suggestion, start exercising, watch what you eat. I'm looking at many of you and you're there, or it's coming up, and many of you are beyond there. So, okay, the youth function is the highest number of young adults are Muslims between 18 and 19, and people between 30 and 45 compared to any other faith. So you've got a strong youth bulge. But an important thing is that not only are Muslims integrated educationally, economically, socially, and increasingly politically, although not as far as they should be, both because you need a drive from within the community so that people realize, don't wait to get appointed to senior political positions, you have to work your way up. But you also function in a society in many parts of the United States where people aren't going to be reaching out. You know, how many people wanted to elect a Jew years ago? How many people wanted to elect a black person years ago? When I was growing up, the idea that you were going to have a black mayor, African-American mayor, was incredible. And even when he was elected, the idea was, there's a problem. And we see that ambivalence with regard to President Obama, okay? But as a former great supporter of President Obama, I am still a supporter, but a more moderate one. So, you know, and he's the best game in town compared to the others. Okay. But they're also integrated religiously, and this is important, as compared to what you would find in most Muslim countries because of the experience here, the experience of what the Imam was talking about. A multi-religious society, a relatively free and open society, if one takes advantage of that. 77% of Muslims say that they worship the same God as Christians and Jews. Whereas we know a significant number of Christians would not say that, and a significant number of Muslims outside the United States, and some within, would not say that, okay? But there's a far more pluralistic, inclusive approach increasingly, and again, even more so among the younger generation. 84% of Muslims said Muslims should strongly emphasize shared values with Christians and Jews. Not that one doesn't recognize differences, but emphasize shared values. Again, significant minorities of Muslims and significant minorities of certain kinds of Christians do not say that even today. So in many ways, ahead of the curve. Now, the acid test of pluralism, as a scholar friend of mine says, Abdulaziz Sachedina, because 33% who were polled said, my religion is the one true faith leading to eternal life. You know what that means. The rest of us have to feel pretty uncomfortable. It's like in going to certain evangelical churches. It's what I call the Hyatt Regency approach to salvation. Hyatt Regencies are great because you got a glass elevator. You know you're going up because you see everybody else going down. And for Christians, some Christians and Muslims, that's what makes them feel good. How do I know I'm going up? Because I know a lot of people are going to go down. And I'm shocked when I get up there and it's a huge ballroom and it's crowded. I expect it's just going to be me and mine. And so then I say something like, oh my God, you let Johor in? You let Mahmoud in? I mean, okay, but nowhere like me. And she does that, and he does that, and how come they seem in a better position than I am? But that's a minority position within that community. And it's a minority position if one is going to talk about living in a global world and in a richly multi-ethnic and multi-religious world. And that's why in some countries we see some of the conflict. It's not that it's simply a religious conflict. It grows out of ethnic diversity, ethnic rivalries, but then they get associated with religion, and it grows out of political and economic differences. Okay. The acid test is when one can get to a point, this is the challenge that some have to run the gauntlet for, when one can say that many religions can lead to eternal life. Now, some of my Muslim and Christian friends have a problem with that. My problem with that is I don't see, for example, if my Muslim friends have a problem with that, I don't see them reading the Quran. They may pray the Quran, but I don't think they read and reflect on the Quran. How can you say that if God says that Jews and Christians are people of the book? How can you say that if God says, I could have created you as one tribe, but I didn't? How can you say that if the Quran says that people of faith should compete with each other in terms of good works, and it's on that basis that they will be rewarded or punished? Kind of difficult. So then you do backflips, and some do. They say things like, oh, that was just the Christians and Jews way back when. It's amazing how insightful people are. Somehow God inspired them to know that. That's another thing we believers have, where we kind of feel that God has picked us to make judgments for God. You know, I was telling somebody I'm on a, I gotta sanitize this a little so you can't figure out where it's from. Not that I care about that at this stage of the game. It's a kind of web where professional academics who are experts on the Middle East and Islam talk. So somebody on there was quoting Ibn Sina on something, and Ibn Sina writing on something, and somebody else came in and said, but how can you do that because Ibn Taymiyyah said that he was an atheist? And then somebody else wrote back and said, but Ibn Sina said he wasn't an atheist. And my response was, to the person who said, Ibn Taymiyyah said, so how can you not realize he's an atheist? I said, gee, I thought that was God's job, with a little smile next to it. But that's true in so many areas of life. You know, some people spend more time looking at somebody else and seeing what's wrong with them and not moving forward, whether it's ethnic differences or religious differences. So when we think about Quranic passages, O humankind, we've created you male and female, made you nations and tribes, not a nation, or the tribe, so that you might come to know one another. To everyone we have appointed a way, a path, a course to follow. For each there is a direction towards which he turns. Compete therefore with one another in the performance of good works. Wherever you may be, God shall bring you all together on Judgment Day. Surely God has power over all things. And I would ask you to note the fact that when you read your Quran, and I hope you do, because you certainly don't want to be somebody who just prays it but doesn't really know where it is in the house when somebody else comes in. When I studied in graduate school, almost all the graduate students are from the Muslim world. And they'd be studying Christianity, so when friends would invite them home, they'd get all excited and say to the mother and father, we're at some point, I want to talk about, St. Paul's epistle or St. Matthew, or I see something in the Old Testament. Could you give me your Bible? Do you have a Bible? They'd all say yes. But then the next question was, where is it? Let me see, where is it? I know I hear it on Sunday, but where is it in my house? Okay. The fact is that when you read your Quran, you'll see how often the Quran refers to believers. And guess what? It's not necessarily in a capital letter. It talks about believers. And then there are other times when it's clear the Quran is talking about Muslims, if you will, in the narrower sense. That often gets lost sight of. Okay, now, what can we say in terms of, as we look at the community and we think about its future? The first thing is the future is always with youth. But of course, I've been saying this for 30 and 40 years, and now the youth are getting older and older. But now we're getting into second and third generation, if we're talking about the immigrant community. And it's putting down the roots more, and therefore, in many ways, one can say that it's a lot more American Muslim than it would have been when parents first came over, or grandparents came over, just as in my own case, in terms of, our being very much Italian-American, in terms of my generation, versus really being Italians who were living in America, or as my Muslim friend Suleiman Nayan says, the famous myth of return that many Muslims have. They're here, they're living here, they're going to die here probably, but they live with the myth of return. They're not quite integrated. I was talking to UCLA about 20 years ago, and I talked about the myth of return, and these two young Muslims said, they said we had problems in Watts, we lived pretty close to Watts, we said to our parents, we really should do something about it. They said, why? They said, we're members of this community. So my colleague calls it, except that he has a great one on myth of return. Suleiman talks about the fact, he refers to evangelicals in the audience and Christians, he says, but you've got a better role. When you want to talk about fundamentalists, he said, you've got how did he call it? You've got tower apartment fundamentalists, because your community is so rich. He said, in fact, you live in these incredible places. He said, whereas a lot of our immigrants, when they come here, they're living and they have to work their way up. But you all seem to be really up there. You think about a lot of the preachers, for example, on television, and their lifestyles. The younger generation is the most important thing, but the fact is the difference between the younger generation in the 20th century and the difference today in the 21st century is that very often a lot of the younger generation are really second or third. So they are young people who have, many of them, have integrated themselves more into the broader community. Their challenge is to keep their roots at the same time, but to do both. Their challenge is to be able to wake up and realize one day, not self-consciously, but just to wake up one day and say, oh gee, I go to the mosque, but gee, a lot of my friends aren't Muslim and I never thought about it. It just turns out that I work with different kinds of people. I went to school with different kinds of people because, again, as we know, if you go to public schools in most of America, you're in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious situation. And that's why when we look at prejudice, the older generations tends to be more prejudiced than a lot in the younger generation. Because if you come out of the older generation, your idea of what it means, your faith, your singleness, especially if you've come from a country where almost everybody's from your faith, it's much different than for kids who wind up relating to people and getting to like them who are just very different because they're with them all the time. It's not that they're separated and wondering, should I bother to have anything to do with them? For young people, the difference too is that there's more access to jobs. Yes, we've always had doctors. Okay, we've got the Pakistani doctor mafia set up. More Pakistani doctors than God has created human beings. And we have audiences. I said to somebody there we go, a little nationalism coming out here. You too can get a Qadi Azam prize. It's great having that prize because most people, when they go to pronounce it, can't pronounce it. So it makes it sound even better than it is, But the reality of it is that for the younger generation now, there are all those other professions in addition to doctor, lawyer, engineer. Journalists, lawyer who works in areas of human rights, lawyers who work in terms of community, and there are many of them doing, but not enough. Media is what gets a community out there. Social media, even more so. If the community is going to be known, it has to be represented in the media. We can all bitch and moan. When you're from Brooklyn, you can use these words very freely. I also use four-letter words at times. I mean love, obviously. But you can bitch and moan all you want when you're a community working your way up, but the only way you make it up is you got to realize you've got to do it. You can't just depend on other people. But media is how you get to know people. In the ethnic world that I grew up in, when I brought my wife to meet my family, my wife is blonde, blue eyes, bright, beautiful, etc. I married her, obviously, for her mind. When I looked at her walking down the street, I said, what a mind. And we were married 47 years, but the reality of it is that, oh, you waving to me, or, oh, okay. I thought she was giving me, you know, like, stop. All right. Because it was going like this, all right. Okay, but I remember bringing her home, and all of a sudden she had no makeup, black dress with no trim, which is what we Italians wear when we were in mourning, hair kind of pulled back, and after it I said, well, how did it go? She said, it was really great. I said, well, why'd you dress that way? Why'd you seem a little nervous? She said, well, the only Italians I know are next door. And she said, you know, they're loud, they fight a lot, you know. Poor woman. I told her they have to be Irish. We Italians aren't like that. You know? We're lovers. We do the great operas, etc. Other people do the bad things in life. But the reality of it was, that's what she knew. You see, and when she watched the media was all about mafia stories. You know? And the reality of it today is, how visible is the Muslim community in the media? And how is it portrayed, but also particularly in the social media. We have a social cancer called Islamophobia, or whatever you want to call it. But it exists, it's real, and it thrives through media images and social media. And media is what creates popular culture in our society today. You know, people are on the internet, they want to know anything. I'm doing a book called What Everyone Needs to Know About Sharia for Oxford University Press, which I tell people I'm dedicating to Michelle Botman, Rick Santora, and Ruth Gingrich. So we know Michelle is not running, so it's okay, it's getting better and better. But the reality of it is that when I go on the internet, if I want to look something up and just see what's on the internet, I can find some websites if you want to look up whatever, you know, family and Islamic law, war and peace, you name it. You can go up and you can find a really good website. Then you find another website has the same exact title, you know, what do Muslims believe about? But it's a hate website. You know, but that's what, and people who don't know, they click on it. And one of the things that we found, I'm involved in a study, is that there's an outfit called Alexa, where you can go up and see how all the different websites are ranked, how many hits they get. Okay, even your best websites that are anti-Islamophobia, you know, Islamophobia Watch, Loon Watch, etc., they score nowhere near at the level that the Islamophobic websites. There was a study done recently by the Center for American Progress. Within a 10-year period, 7 major foundations, whether they knew it or not, gave $42.5 million to Islamophobic authors and Islamophobic websites. That was just 7 of those foundations. Okay, so that's where, again, for youth to be in media becomes really important. For youth to be in areas of exposure, in politics, in local politics, in social services, for Muslims to be more and more active working in the community, but not only within their own community, but other communities. All of that becomes very important in terms of developing this kind of integrated approach. So what's the challenge as we move forward? The challenge primarily revolves, from my point of view, around engagement. Engagement within the community at every level, and within the broader community at every level. Religious, educational, school, social, professional. It involves getting to know and understand the richness and diversity, not only of your own faith, but other faiths. It means becoming more inclusive rather than exclusive. Not only with regard to other faiths, but with regard to your own. We all know the whole Sunni-Shia problem. It's not just global, it's also here, you know, or Ismaili problem. I told somebody, I gave a talk at Oxford University. It was a seminar with mostly young Muslims from America. They got along fine. We had a great discussion. Then we got a certain point of theology, and one of them said to the other, guy from New York, the guy in New Jersey, "You're Ismaili." So the guy looked at him. The way he looked at the guy was, "Isn't that obvious? I just told you the problem. You're Ismaili. You're not a real Muslim. You're not a Paka Muslim, etc. You're not, okay." So it's moving to that point. Also displaying self-criticism. One of the things when we're a minority community is we don't want to be self-critical publicly because we feel everybody else is saying nasty things, so we don't want to acknowledge. I remember going to Singapore, dealing with the Muslim community, and they did some really good videos, this kind of cutting edge. They got nailed when they finally did something on violence towards women within their community. They were addressing their community, but for community members, if you make a video, it gets out. But the self-criticism becomes important. One cannot deny that there are extremists outside and that there can be extremists within the country. You don't deny it. What you do is you learn what the stats are. If you look at the stats, it's an infinitesimal percentage. Dangerous, for example, in terms of homegrown terrorists, but very, very small. On the other hand, if you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, you will see that the vast majority of extremists in America are not Muslims. They come from, I won't go there, just look at their website. But they, and they're not just the yahoos, they're not just the rednecks. That's the thing in our country, and that's what makes them dangerous. Some of the people who are most anti-immigrant and are most negative are super wealthy and well-positioned in society, and are senior members of government. We see that. We see that in the elections with regard to Muslims when Obama ran the first time, and when he ran the second time, not only in what they were saying about whether Obama was a Muslim or not, but the debates that candidates got into of whether or not they'd have a Muslim in their cabinet, whether or not Muslims could, be a good citizen, etc. And they weren't, as in Europe, these new anti-immigrant parties. In America, we are blessed to have real bigots in our two major political parties. And we are blessed to have members of those parties who are good and true people, but who don't have the guts to stand up and really denounce their colleagues. So that they might remain quiet, you see, and not approve, but very seldom will they step out front and distance themselves. The way, for example, Powell did when it came to the question of whether or not Obama was a Muslim and the role of Muslims in America, of actually differing with his party publicly. Same thing has to happen in terms of Muslims, that is, in terms of that sense of self-criticism. The recognition that all religions have a transcendent side, but they all have a dark side. What believers like to do is, I compare my ideal to your real. You see, my ideal is about, Allah, mashallah, God, the Prophet, Quran. My ideal is about Jesus, the New Testament, etc., and all of that. But no, you want to tell me about the Inquisition, you want to tell me about the Crusades. But on my side, that really wasn't Islam, what was done. But you've got to say that may not really be Islam, but members of your faith did it. I remember doing a dialogue once in which I was the Muslim. In the old days, they couldn't find a Muslim. So this was Boston, too. And I was representing a Muslim, and I was talking with a Christian who happened to be an authority on medieval Islam as well as a priest. And at one point he was talking about jihad, and this was like 40 years ago, but he saw jihad and everything. When Indians and Pakistanis went at each other, it wasn't because of a lot of reasons. It was, it's jihad here, it's jihad there, it's jihad. When you know that some Muslim leaders, the only time they pray is when there's a camera. But anyway, we don't want to name them, do we? Okay. But the reality of it was, this fellow, when he was doing this, I said, well, what about the Crusades and the Inquisition? And he said, with regard to the Inquisition, he said, we just tried them. I.e., we tried them and somebody else killed them. The state was responsible. Whoever the ruler was responsible. So we have to see that transcendent and dark side. And that's what enables us to make our own community strong. If we see the dark side, then we want to be more inclusive, because we realize the dark side is not only a dark side towards the other faiths, but it raises its head within our own community. And on the other hand, we want to recognize the shared beliefs and values and interests that we have, whether it's family, whether it's shared beliefs in terms of God, moral accountability and responsibility, whether it's issues of safety and security, but not feel that we have to deny the differences. And that's, again, what I liked about the Imam, when he talked about we have our differences, and our differences can still belong. By belonging, it doesn't mean that it has to belong to me directly, that I have to buy into the differences. But it does mean if we're going to live in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and even within our faiths, we have to have mutual respect and understanding. So we've got to respect the right of somebody to believe differently than we do. You know, that doesn't mean that we have to buy into everything that they believe. It becomes a big challenge. And finally, it's really to remember that what America is about, from my point of view, America is about a country that believes in having space for belief and non-belief, and having space for people of all belief. America is a country that says, you know, I like that movie, Pay It Forward. I think it's a very good moral in everybody's life, you know, and it's great, you know, when you help somebody or somebody's helped you, to remember when the time comes that you're supposed to pay it forward. I find a lot of times certain younger people always believe that pay it forward means their parents pay it forward, you know, and then when they have children, their kids should pay it, you know, backward, you know. My mother lived in an area where Christians were a strong minority. They moved from a totally Italian neighborhood to a different kind of neighborhood. And people used to comment on how much her children visited versus theirs. And part of the reason was the other people's kids always knew that when they came, their parents would be telling them what they did wrong, or their parents would say to my parents, you know, I go to see them and they don't take me out every night, or they don't do X and Y. And my mother would say, but you're telling me both your kids work, you know? So my parents would come up and they would do stuff at my house. But it's that pay it forward. Well, what that means is that for many Muslims, they're making it on their own, but they're making it in a community that is a broader community where they need to feel that there are those who are going to be very pluralistic in reaching out to them, working with them, voting for them if they run for office, etc. But the real test is, what do you do when your community becomes the established community with the next? You know, after 9/11, it was very disheartening to me to see a guy, a gas station on the front page of like the New York Times. Obviously, I wouldn't say USA Today, although it's sometimes a better read. But in any case, gas station, Italian-American name saying, send them all back where they came from, but referring to Muslims. And I'm thinking, you're probably second generation at most, and suddenly, you know what, you came over on the Mayflower? You know what I mean? You know, that kind of mentality. So, I'm delighted to be here. You've got a great and growing community, but, you know, the challenge is how you continue to build that community. And remember that, as my Lebanese interlocutor said when my wife and I lived in Lebanon, and he said after being with us for 3 weeks, you're a really nice couple, and I want to tell you what you need to really get along in Lebanon. And I thought, this is going to be this cultural insight. And as he said, remember that tonight. Thank you.